we're told that the amount of available information in our world will soon double every 12 hours. And given the mind-bogglingly huge amount of information that is available, that is an almost unthinkable thought. I feel that we are actually drowning in information, and that information tells us less and less about who we really are, and that it needs to be balanced with another view and another kind of gaining knowledge, another way of knowing, and that we can find that way of knowing in our own history. And that's what this talk is about. And the first question I want to ask, one that I came across recently actually, is who was the last person who knew everything? And it's an interesting concept, which I hadn't thought about before, that there was a time in the not too distant past necessarily when one single human being could have encompassed all of human knowledge. And speculations about who that is range from Aristotle going back to antiquity, or an English parson in the early 19th century who knew an incredible amount about an incredible amount of things. But regardless of who it was, we're clearly well past that stage now. And we were probably past that stage even then in the early 19th century. In fact, I'm sure we were. And to illustrate that, it's interesting to think about the rate of increase in scientific information. By one estimate, we're doubling in terms of our scientific knowledge every 9 years. But going to, say, one domain of science, the science of medicine, how much new information are we producing each year? How many new facts are we producing each year? Well, let's look at the number of publications, the number of scientific papers that are published each year. And that's approaching about 1 million. So I decided to calculate how high of a pile of paper that would be if you were actually to print out every paper. And it turns out it would be about 3 miles high. It would also take one person about 3,000 years to read them all. So we're very clearly past the time when one person could encompass all of human knowledge. And that opens a very big question as to what this knowledge then really means to us. And we can go into, for example, it's interesting to then limit it. Let's go into the knowledge that we have about a single human cell. And we're made up of 10 trillion cells of different kinds. A single human cell, it turns out, there is no way a single human being can encompass the knowledge of all that goes on inside a single human cell. In fact, that would take football fields of computers to even begin to approach, and actually it's beyond our current technology to do so. That's the complexity that's there. So Humpty Dumpty has been broken into more than 1 trillion pieces, and we can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. How do we get a sense of the whole of a human being? How many human beings would it take to encompass all of the knowledge of everything that goes on inside a human body? If we're to assemble ourselves, if we're to assemble wholes from all of this detail and all of these facts, how do we ever get a sense of the whole? In fact, that's obviously not possible. So there's another kind of faculty that's required, and I believe that going into history, we can see that faculty in operation, and we can find it in particular characters in history too. And in recent years, I discovered an idea that seemed familiar to me from my experiences hiking in nature here in Sedona. And this was the idea of the Book of Nature. And it's an idea that was present as an important idea, a fundamental idea, throughout enormous spans of time, roughly 1,500 years, around the death of Christ to about the mid-Renaissance, 18th century, roughly. And this idea, the Book of Nature, can perhaps best be conveyed by reading you a quote from St. Augustine, who was alive in the 4th century AD. And it's one of many, many quotes that one can find on the Book of Nature. And they all convey something quite profound. So I'd like to read you this quote. Some people, in order to discover God, read books. But there is a great book, the very appearance of created things. Look above you, look below you, note it, read it. God, whom you want to discover, never wrote that book in ink. Instead, he set before your eyes the things that he had made. Can you ask for a louder voice than that? Why, heaven and earth shout to you, God made me. St. Augustine thought that there were two significant books, the book of Scripture and the book of Nature, and they were both to be read in the same way, and that is allegorically. You had to wrestle with these books like you wrestled with a poem. And nature was seen in a literary way. And what that means, what that meant, was something actually very radical for today's world, because it meant that nature meant something. Instead of seeing nature as a machine, as mechanical, it meant something. You read the sentences in a book, you read the paragraphs, you read the story, it means something to us. And nature meant something. One could derive important information on an intuitive level, I would say, for one's life. And the reason to read the book of nature was the same reason why you would read the book of Scripture. Also allegorically, which was to develop the development of the human being, the development of qualities of the human being that would bring you closer to a knowledge of God. And we can translate that into modern language. And in order to do that, perhaps I can talk a little about my own experience with reading the book of nature. As shallow as that might be, because I am a product of the modern world. But on my time in nature around Sedona, I often feel that nature has a kind of voice, that it is speaking to me, that it is communicating something. Something is being communicated. And what is that thing that's being communicated? Well, from my experience, my perception, it's telling me about who I really am and what really is. And it speaks of a kind of wholeness. It speaks of my wholeness, it speaks of the wholeness of nature and the wholeness of things in nature. The wholeness of individual things in nature are symbolic in a way, or feel that they point to a greater wholeness. We belong in a greater wholeness. We are part of a greater wholeness. So for me, this voice, this book of nature, speaks about a kind of true nature which relates to relationship and belonging and wholeness. So this communication is obviously not happening on a verbal level in the usual ways. It's a form of perception, actually, I believe. And I think it's a form of perception, a faculty, in fact, that we used to have that has become disused. We still have it, but it's disused, it's unused and undeveloped, and requires practice to develop it. But at a time when we were reading the book of nature, we felt, I think, more whole. We felt like we belonged in this world, that we were a part of it, a participant in it. And I think we need that feeling today. And so, unscientific as it may be, that may not invalidate the truth of this experience. That we could actually read the book of nature, we could develop that faculty, and that would change our relationship with nature and with ourselves. And that would counterbalance, at the very least, counterbalance the inundation of data, our drowning in data and information and facts that we have today. It would be a part of reassembling Humpty Dumpty, which is what we need. And we also need to find ourselves and to change our relationship with nature.